Welcome. We are delighted to have you join us for this webinar focused on conducting digital therapeutics impactful studies in the EU market. Our sincere gratitude goes to Lindus Health for their sponsorship, making this event possible. Lindus Health is an anti-CRO helping biotech and health tech pioneers run radically faster, more reliable clinical trials. So a couple of housekeeping rules for this webinar. First, this is recorded and it will be shared with all DTA members and registrants. And we want this to be an interactive experience, so please use the chat and Q&A function to share your thoughts and questions throughout the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Okay, so we can start with the speakers. Next slide, please. Mary, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me. So my name is Mary Beckwith. I'm co-founder of Lindus Health. Yep. So as you gave us a bit of an intro already because we're sponsoring the event, but we run end-to-end clinical trials for life sciences and health tech pioneers, including some of the people on this panel, maybe even. But essentially, we are a partner to sort of run everything from study design through to actually executing the study through to close out. And we have lots of experience with both DiGA in Germany and now emerging in PECAN in France too. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mary. Torsten?
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. My name is Torsten. I'm founder and chief medical officer of PerFood. We are a Germany-based startup and develop digital therapeutics based on personalized nutrition. We use nutrition as an active ingredient. We have 2 DiGAs approved. One is Sincephalea for the treatment of migraine, and one is Glucura for patients with type 2 diabetes.
Thank you, Torsten. And François?
Hi, I'm François Gontran. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Poppins. Poppins is a DTX mainly specialized in neurodevelopmental disorder in pediatrics. Our job is to give to those kids access to care, specifically in the fields of learning disorders, meaning dyslexia. It's a DTX 5 clinical trials, randomized, double-blind, so clinically validated. It's been a long journey to demonstrate the clinical value of our product, and now moving to the reimbursements.
Thank you, François. And now we can deep dive into the agenda. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, we'll explore some of the considerations when running studies for digital therapeutics in the EU market, with a specific focus on the PECAN pathways in France and the German fast track for DiGA. We'll also dive into consideration when thinking about how data may be used across countries. So my first question is for Torsten. Can you walk us through the DiGA fast track in Germany, please?
Yeah, sure. Actually, we have this DiGA system now in the 4th year in Germany. And DiGA is an acronym that stands for Digital Health Application, if you would translate that to English, and it corresponds to what we know as a prescription digital therapeutic. So the fundamental idea of the lawmakers, maybe to start at the very beginning, was to push the German healthcare system into actively using digital applications in the treatment of diseases. So DiGAs are on the same level as medication, assistive equipment, and like medicinal remedies. And as soon as you have your device approved as a DiGA, you can reach all patients in Germany who are covered by the statutory health insurance. And this is basically like 90% of all the patients in Germany. And then if you have that approval and you are a DiGA, then the costs are fully covered by the insurance, no questions asked, and there are normally no costs of any kind for the patient. So you see that DiGAs are very much wanted by the politics and by the system, but at the same time, it was defined that DiGAs have to fulfill like several criteria to ensure that DiGAs are of a high quality and bring effectiveness to the patient. So first of all, and that's what you see on the left of this slide, you have to be a MDR certified medical device. So can be risk class 1 or 2A. This will change this year. You see there will be the first changes in law this year. So it's like an adaptive system trying to learn easily and quickly. But for now, you have to be a medical class 1 or 2A MDR certified medical device. And it has to act via its digital function. So it's not like a telemedicine device or a device facilitating in-human coaching. So it has to act via its digital main function. And next, a DiGA has to support a treatment on the patient side. So it not address any concerns of the doctors and does not need any input of the HCPs. So it's just basically something you give your patient at home. They will work with the DiGA and the DiGA will support the treatment. And it's also meant, not meant for prevention, but meant for treatment purposes only. So in addition, DiGA has to fulfill many requirements on data security and data protection, even beyond what you know from GDPR, and it has to be interoperable. So this is like the basic requirement. It has to be a device, it has to fulfill all these extra criteria, but very central is then that the DiGA needs to present clinical data proving the healthcare effect of the DiGA. So like our migraine device, you have to show that it's like a reduction in migraine days or improvement in body weight or improvement in quality of life. This depends on the disease and it depends on the intended use of your device. And either you have confirmatory data from a randomized controlled trial at the beginning, then this qualifies directly your DiGA to be approved permanently. That's basically the end of the process. But you can start with a preliminary DiGA listing, and that you get if you have convincing and plausible clinical data, but not coming from a controlled trial. And you can get this access to reimbursement for 12 months. This can be extended one time to 2 years. And during that time, then you have to fulfill the requirement to present data from a controlled trial, confirmatorily proving the effectiveness of your device. And this whole process, that's the BfArM, that's like the Federal Institute of Medical Devices and Pharmaceuticals. This proving process, this verification process needs or takes 3 months. And this is like what we call a fast-tracked mechanism, because it's clearly written in the law that after 3 months, you have to get either the approval or they decline your submission to get the DiGA. And maybe to sum the thing up, a last word about prices. It's very easy, very similar to what we know in Germany to the pricing system of pharmaceuticals. So in the first year, the manufacturer can set his own price, and the insurance have to cover that price. But after 1 year, you negotiate the price with the insurances. You don't start after 1 year, it will be in retrospective, you change the price. And this is why the prices change within the DiGA system. Yeah, just a rough overview about the DiGA path.
Thank you, Torsten. And we have the same question. François, can you walk us through the French PECAN pathway, please?
Sure. DiGA was an inspiration, definitely, to build the PECAN, but there are a couple of differences. First one, still a medical device, so still need to be CE marked before apply to the PECAN. But it just allows, comparatively to the DiGA, more class. You can be a class 2B or class 3 that's allowed for the PECAN. We said the main other difference is that the clinical data should be available actually really at the start of the process. I'm mainly going to talk about the DTX, the DTX part, so on the high. So when you apply for the PECAN, there is the presumption of innovation that need to be already there, and you need to have all your data before 6 months. So that's really short. And actually, it's much more to help companies like ours to get access to reimbursement 6 months earlier than to really fund a clinical trial. So when you apply, you have 6 months to finish your randomized control trials, to finish and to have all the data you need. Sorry, can you hear me? Just a bug. Okay, cool. Sorry. So when you apply, you have 6 months to finish your randomized control trial, to have all your data, and then you move to a double evaluation. The first one's going to be led by the HRS in France. They're going to be responsible to give an opinion on the clinical value of your file. The second one, at the same time, is going to be led by the ANS, much more on the interoperability. And those have to be done in 45 days. So that's pretty short, and that's pretty good news. Then you'll move to a negotiation period, and it's going to last for 6 months. Those 6 months are really important, and that is where there is a really huge need to have clinical data, because the CEPS in France really will negotiate the price, and that's where it's pretty hard. Currently, there are around 20 files that applied for the PECAN, but it's a way much younger process than the DiGAs. So for now, there are no DTX really that went directly to the LPPR. The two companies that already go to the LTM are much more on remote therapeutic measure. If you are a telemonitoring company, I won't say it's easier, but that's more clearer because prices are known and you have a better clarification about what is expected there.
Thank you, François. So Mary, what kind of clinical evidence, we saw a little bit of the kind of clinical evidence that are required for each pathways, but do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, happy to talk through a bit of this, maybe focusing on DiGA first, because it obviously has sort of more history. Guidelines for like standards of clinical evidence are published by BayPharm, and they're generally sort of pretty helpful. But like all regulatory guidance, there's a little bit of gray area, and there's kind of an emerging like sort of precedent that gets set and then sometimes overturned based on the decisions, BayPharm makes. Maybe just to sort of, summarize this, when it comes to DiGA, firstly, obviously the gold standard is sort of randomized control trials. What I think is interesting about DiGA is that, BayPharm generally tends to take the view that, a sort of much more permissive view about kind of what can count as a control group. Sort of generally the goal is to compare sort of the application of the product versus what is essentially the standard of care. This can be both kind of a good and a bad thing. So if you compare it to like, I don't know, like getting certified under a 510K or a de novo pathway for a digital therapeutic product, the FDA can be very specific about like using a sham app as a comparator, which can be a real pain, frankly, for a number of reasons. Whereas with DiGA, it's much more about like, let's just find something that matches the standard of care. That can mean things like waitlist controls are viable. So, what we've seen some DiGA manufacturers do for their clinical study is have essentially a waitlist control where they basically have just one, cohort of patients collecting data for, 3 or 6 months before their enrollment in a study, or even retrospectively by pulling data from, their electronic health records, and then enrolling them in a study and then collecting prospective data. That's a lot more kind of cost efficient than running sort of a standard 2-arm RCT because you have half the number of patients, for instance. This approach, like this sort of comparator approach, does present some challenges. So for instance, if your treatment is like an adjunct to standard therapy, you need to think very carefully about, okay, well, we need to make sure the standard therapy that we're essentially including in the clinical trial is actually representative of the kind of therapy or, the kind of treatment that patients could get, which is, can sometimes be tricky to do. But yeah, overall, I think, the DiGA guidelines are pretty good. They're, there's a little bit of sort of gray area, and it's worth engaging with, an expert to help you kind of understand what are some of the latest, judgments, like I guess that BayPharm has ruled on. But overall, pretty permissive, and generally, pretty helpful for digital therapeutics companies, unlike, say, some of the FDA's guidance, which, really feels like it's still built for a kind of traditional, class 3 invasive medical device. PECAN is still sort of, pretty new, but we're, likewise, we're seeing a good degree of sort of, flexibility and pragmatism there too, which is great.
Thank you. Mary, again, can you enlighten us on data portability in the EU market?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'll sort of talk about DiGA first because there's sort of more history. But you know, obviously, one thing the DiGA guidelines are very clear on is the need to have, you know, clinical data generated in Germany. So you know, only data generated on German subjects is accessible, which essentially means if you're not a, you know, if you're not a German company, you're unlikely to have, you know, clinical data from Germany. So that kind of looks like running a fresh study. To be honest, you'd probably have to anyway for DiGA. It would probably make sense anyway, just because of the you know, the guidelines are obviously different from something like a study to support a CE mark or whatnot. So DiGA, you need to study in Germany on German subjects. PECAN, the rules are actually more permissive. So I believe they don't specify that, you know, the clinical data needs to come from France. But to be honest, I don't believe anyone has really tested this by submitting data, say, from Germany as part of a you know, as part of the PECAN process. So yeah, we'll have to kind of wait and see on that one. I mean, obviously, you know, in wider Europe, it gets a bit messier for kind of other things. But and I was probably outside of the scope of this webinar. Yeah.
Thank you. And what are frequent mistakes that DTX manufacturers make when they're designing studies? Mary.
For me, yeah. Okay, so I mean, you know, this is just stuff, you know, we've picked up from working with a number of manufacturers in sort of both you know, both channels and hearing about some others. So I would say, you know, the DiGA guidelines are not, I mean, they're obviously published by Baypharm, but they're not the same as kind of, you know, the guidelines for MDR or even MDD in Germany. So you do need to pay, you know, careful attention to them. We would also suggest working with, you know, an expert who has helped, who has helped others, you know, other companies with their DiGA listings. As I say, there are guidelines, but there's always kind of a gray area of interpretation. And, you know, BfArM's interpretation on certain things like has changed recently. So I think the same goes for PECAN, you know, helpful to work with an expert. Maybe give a shout out to F-Beta in Germany, who, you know, we've worked with before, who are kind of experts in, you know, guiding companies through the DiGA process. So what other mistakes have we seen? I mean, yeah, so, you know, I mentioned that the sort of the comparator for kind of comparator studies needs to be closely matched with essentially standard of care or real practice, which, you know, can be a benefit because it's quite permissive, but you also need to think very carefully about, you know, what real practice looks like in each country. You know, I would say also for DiGA, stratification is really important. So we have seen Baypharm either like reject or only provide kind of very limited approvals for certain studies that weren't, you know, very well stratified along factors like age and you know, severity or type of disease. So, you know, would really advocate thinking carefully about, you know, gender as well, severity of disease, any other main factors. I believe with DiGA, you can also refer to you know, the way kind of each disease is sort of classified by Baypharm. And so, for instance, for type 2 diabetes, I believe the sort of stratification factors they'll look for will be like whether patients are using, you know, metformin or on other, you know, other medications and things like that. But yeah, it just pays to think through the design quite carefully. Because, you know, the alternative is you could run a study and you could find that Baypharm sort of only, you know, only grants approval for like, you know, I think female only patients, for instance. I'm trying to think else. I mean, one other sort of, you know, mistake I would just call out is when designing and running studies, you know, offering a patient stipend, a patient payment for taking part in the study. Again, there's sort of limited guidance on, like, direct guidance on this from the regulators. But, you know, we've generally found that offering a payment for patients taking part can have a very positive return on investment. So, you know, it's the money you offer is more than paid back in terms of faster patient enrollment, lower costs for patient enrollment. But you do need to be careful because ethics committees and the regulator can sometimes frown on like excessive patient payments. generally anything above 50 euros per hour of like a patient's time for you know, a low risk medical device study might be considered excessive. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up, but yeah, happy to chat through these further.
Well, thank you, Mary. Torsten and Francois, I had like a question for you. Could you please share what the lesson learned along your commercialization journey, and what are the obstacles and successes you've encountered so far? And if you have any pieces of advice for earlier stage DTX manufacturers to share, that would be also very nice. Maybe Torsten, do you want to start?
Yes, and I'd like to add something to what Mary said, because in the DiGA or in the guidelines for getting the DiGA approved, there are a lot of possibilities mentioned. So in theory, you have a variety of data you can hand in. But on the other hand, you have this practical world in which the BfArM has to judge. And it's interesting because there, to my knowledge, is no DiGA approved yet with data from outside of Germany, as Mary said, because I really rely on Germany data or Germany-based data. But in theory, you could hand in data from other countries, but then you have to show that this is transferable, right? But I don't know a case in which this has done. So it's something like, in theory, it could be possible, but nobody really knows how that turn out and how the BfArM would judge on that. So if you now would try to go this path, you have a lot of uncertainty, and this, of course, increases a little bit the risk in trying to getting this approval. And exactly the same is with the kind of studies you have to perform, because as of now, for the permanent listing, there have only been RCTs questioned and required by the BfArM. But in theory, you could use other kind of control groups, like historic control groups, for instance. But you see that although things are in theory makeable, it doesn't mean that at the end you really will be successful with that. So the lawmakers in Germany gave the BfArM a lot of decisions in their hands because they wanted to be flexible and they wanted to have this process iterative, and they wanted to just have the authorities to learn. So a little bit unusual, because normally you would expect that all the rules are written down and everything is exactly clear, but it's not this case. And seeing that now after 4 years only, the first amendment to the law will be taking place, see that indeed they try to adapt to the first learnings. That's quite interesting. So not really an answer to your question, but this is what I just wanted to add to what Mary said about the DiGA thing. And I think this could be also like a difference between France and Germany, because now we have a lot of examples in Germany. You can orientate yourself, and this is definitely a learning for me, for instance, because we have two DiGAs in different indication fields. One is migraine and one is diabetes. So migraine, in that field, nutrition as a medicine is very innovative and very unusual. So we really had to convince the authorities a lot that this is a solid approach, and we had to hand in a lot of data. We had to perform several pilot trials. We had to hand in publications and peer-reviewed journals. It was a really hard work to get the approval for the migraine device. Whereas now in diabetes, nutrition as a medicine is a very accepted and standard way of treating the disease. And secondly, there are already some DiGAs for diabetes. So we could just follow the trial protocols of other DiGA manufacturers. It was very much easier, and we could achieve DiGA approval just in the first try. So a learning for me was that you really have to understand how the authorities think. My learning was that what you learn in academic science is not basically the same you need for working with authorities. It's just a different world, a different language. They look for different things. And having a lot of examples makes your life just easier. And now I think this is very interesting in France with the PECAN process, because this is very new, like as new as the DiGA process was 4 years ago. Now we just have to see and learn, as Mary said. So it will be interesting, but I assume that it will be tough for the first movers in this field too. François, over to you.
Definitely to reply in that. I mean, the first companies that going to move into PECAN, they're going to be RCT backed. I mean, unfortunately, there's no way it's going to be different. And I think we have the same than you in Germany. We have this, there is huge flexibility on the paper. The team, they really want to take into account real world evidence and so on. But for now, the reality is that the HRS will consider RCT as the gold standard, and that should be the way DTX is going to be taken care of. So for at least, I would say, a couple of years, we don't really expect any change on that. And I mean, on our side, we're definitely moving to reimbursement backed by a clinical randomized squad trial. And I guess that will be the case for the first 10 to 15 companies that are going to go into reimbursements. And to answer your question, Emilia, I think one of the key learning for us was really the recruitment and how to manage the recruitment compared to this really short period of time. You have to really finish your process. When you take a look at the PECAN and DiGA, that's almost the same. The period to really finish your randomized your trial is really, really short. You have in France just 6 months. So, I mean, nobody can really run a trial in 6 months. That's crazy, right? So you have to really start your trial earlier, for sure. But you have also to exploit all the digital part of the product. And that's, I think, something we really realized by pushing almost e-consent in our previous study. It wasn't e-consent, to be honest, because, I mean, it wasn't approved. So we've done all the consentment through La Poste. So basically later, it's pretty crazy, but eventually it worked. So we really were trying to digitalize everything from recruitment to inclusion to be kind of our own CRO, I would say, actually, but really to streamline everything, because our products are digital. So that's the only way to recruit 20, 40, 50 patients a month. And that's the only way to really eventually being able to run your trial in 6 months, 1 year, something that otherwise that wouldn't be feasible, and otherwise you would be out of cash before your trial ends.
I just jump in there. Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and something we've seen a lot in Germany, something that we've seen a lot work well in Germany for DiGA is a decentralized study. One, as you say, Francois, digital devices, so it's quite natural that they kind of work in a home setting. But two, with a decentralized study, you can recruit patients from anywhere in Germany in DiGA's case, which obviously speeds up recruitment. It's kind of a myth that decentralized studies are somehow not acceptable in Germany. We've seen numerous DCTs run, just fine with ethics approval, and lead to DiGA listings in Germany. So would definitely advocate that approach. I think France is a little bit more of a gray area, but as I understand, still possible. But obviously it depends, from our perspective, like whenever we help a company run a study, we're totally agnostic as to whether it's decentralized or site-based. We just want to propose, whatever design helps meet the objectives. And with something like this, if a decentralized design is possible, then it's worth exploring. But yeah.
The way we manage that, sorry, Thorsten.
I just wanted to say something about this timeline, because we have 12 months after you receive the preliminary DiGA approval. And this sounds just much more than 6 months, but I think still 12 months is very crazy. Performing a randomized controlled trial in 12 months is very challenging. And very often this could be as challenging as that you haven't finished your recruitment in that time. I mean, it's possible in Germany to ask for an extension of this preliminary time up to 2 years, but this you have to apply for. It's not for granted that you get this extension approved. And one key thing the BfArM looks for before approving getting this extension is that you are really far ahead of recruitment. So you see, one very, very crucial thing is that you are good in recruiting and can recruit well patients into your study. So it's, I mean, obviously easier if you have big patient groups, like very prevalent diseases. And in Germany, you can start earlier, but during that preliminary approval process, your study protocol is one of the things that BfArM has a look at. And it can happen that at the end of your approval process, the BfArM suggests changes here to your study protocol. So if you start before getting the preliminary approval with your study, it could end up having like 2 protocol versions in which you recruited your patients, which basically could be a problem for your data validity. So you wait for the BfArM to respond to your study protocol, but then you loses time for getting the study finished in 12 months. So it's like a little bit of a dilemma. You have to strategically be very well aligned here and have some good ideas, and then of course getting the study started very quickly.
Yeah, actually, Jessica, I just saw your question in the chat. I mean, I hope that answers it. But if I could, plug us for a second. I mean, I think, we've obviously it usually depends on the eligible patient population you're going for, but we've had a lot of success recruiting large studies in a few weeks to a couple of months, both by, again, this decentralized approach, running kind of a centralized recruitment campaign, as well as things we can do, like we partner with mainly sort of primary care physicians in Germany. We don't have to activate them as study sites, but they can still refer their patients onto our studies, often by screening those patients' electronic health records. So that's how we're able to, for instance, screen patients with, recent HbA1c tests that would put them in an eligible range for a type 2 diabetes study, and then enroll them. I mean, one other thought on recruitment speed is this study design point where, using like a retrospective waitlist control, you can often reduce the number of patients you need to recruit, thereby effectively speeding up patient recruitment. So although, it may seem like a challenge, there are lots of tactics you can deploy to hit full enrollment under that time.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we can now start answering the questions that have been sent to either the chat or the Q&A, and the questions we've already received too. So feel free to jump in whenever you want to answer one of the questions. So the first question we had is, how relevant are usability data and acceptance consensus generation to market entry?
So I can start first, because you need usability data to get your CE marked medical device. So this is very early in the process that you need some kind of acceptance data and usability testing. Then for getting the market approval, I don't see a high need for having that. But you shouldn't forget that at the end, if you have a good device working fine, having high usability ratings, having good clinical data, you still have to market your device. So all your commercial activities at the end are very crucial. And for this, of course, it can help that physicians feel comfortable in prescribing the device and patients feel comfortable in using the device and feel really that using the device brings some improvement for their life and for reducing the pain they have with the disease. So at the end, of course, it's very important that the people using your device and prescribing your device feel comfortably in doing so. Just to start the discussion.
Same in France. That's a prerequisite for the CE mark, so that won't be really taken into account for the market approval in itself. Won't do a difference.
What are typical all-in costs, including the clinical trial, for gaining a DiGA PECAN list or PECAN listing? Actually, both.
I can provide some benchmarks. I don't know if Torsten and Francois, you can share as well, maybe. But obviously, big caveat, it varies a lot depending on the type of clinical trial you need to conduct, kind of how ready your device is. This obviously excludes like the CE marking process, which is separate. But we've seen everything from like it cost companies 150, kind of 200,000 all in, to substantially more than that, maybe up to about $1 million. I would say, luckily, because of the DiGA and sort of PECAN clinical trial requirements, they do favor like you don't need to do tons of monitoring. You don't need to do tons of kind of expensive sort of longer follow-ups. By their nature, shorter studies are less expensive. So you're certainly looking at costs that are much lower than like a traditional, I don't know, sort of RCT for a drug product or something, or even a class 3 medical device. But yeah. And those figures would include, oh, sorry, Emily. Yeah, I was just saying those figures would include, the costs of kind of like consulting and help around, dealing with BfArM, HAS, kind of the whole process as well.
You're talking in euros, right?
Yeah, although all increasingly the same nowadays, but yeah, in euros, yeah.
So we done a query with lots of German DiGA manufacturers, and they asked for the proportion of costs, how much goes to what. And roughly you can say that mostly DiGA manufacturers say that around 40% of the cost goes to product concept and building the product, programming the device. 40% goes to studies, and 20% goes to other regulatory requirements. You have to need a lot of ISO certifications. You have to fulfill a lot of data security and things. You are part of providing care, and therefore you have to be really strict and following a lot of rules. And this is approximately 20% of your costs. So what I know as benchmarks for trials, I mean, this varies tremendously depending on the size, on the kind of assessments you do. But I know numbers between 0.5 million and 2 million, depending on the size and if it's a pilot trial or an RCT. So, I mean, you can really make it more expensive, but you can really try to start cheap. What we learned at Perfoot is that you really, really should invest in quality, because at the end, you gain much success by having high quality data. So DiGA is not something you can just make quickly, and it's something you can make easily.
That's super interesting data, actually, on the breakdown of costs, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, I guess like a lot of the companies we work with already have those ISO standards, CE mark already, and so the incremental cost for like a DiGA listing is maybe a bit lower. But I can see how perhaps a company from the US might be a little bit different, just based on you might not already be adhering to GDPR, for instance. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Some figure here, around 1,500,000 to 1 million, but I do not count actually all the CE mark litigation and product development, which is actually, yeah, at least 40%. That's huge. That's huge, definitely. So yeah, some figures interesting.
I mean, in the context of what people spend on market access in the US, though, with multiple potentially for different payer systems, it kind, I mean, and certainly like in the landscape of pharma trials, which we're also pretty familiar with, these are not huge sums of money. So but I guess it all depends on the context. Yeah,
I mean, the DTA Alliance published something about that, actually, to build the DTX product. I don't know if you remember, Emily, it was like a couple of years ago. And I remind reading that and thinking, oh, actually, that's being in Europe, it's 10 times lower. So yeah, compared to the US, that would be even pretty cheap.
Although you shouldn't forget that these are development costs, right? Then you have all your commercialization costs, right? Your customer acquisition costs, and it depends whether you go through the patient or through the HCP in marketing your product. Of course, a B2B approach is much more expensive, although it may be more valuable. So you have a lot of costs down the road too, but then you have a product hopefully in the market and get some revenue out of that. So it's different as starting developing and not knowing whether you will make anything out of it when you start with your idea and starting designing and building.
Thank you. And I think we can jump onto this question that is related to what we talked about. Mary, I saw you answered that in the chat, but if you could give a bit more details. Can data collected in Germany be used for submission to FDA, so in the US?
Sorry, I saw it. I was just like, I couldn't help myself but type an answer. But no, thank you for the question. So in theoretically, yes, but practically, and I haven't seen many people do it. In theory, the FDA is comfortable assuming that I think the guidance says that if the patient population is a good match, they don't really define what that means, of course, for kind of the US population, but it'll be things like ethnicity, other demographic features. I think in reality, you'd be running a big risk. And I think also, like, we've seen some people, try and run one study, both in Germany, like one study for DiGA and also for like a US, 510K or de novo listing. In practice, like the requirements that the FDA imposes around comparator, around endpoints, just mean that very quickly it just looks so different. And, the Venn diagram of possible study designs becomes very small, or you'd have to massively blow, your study design such that it would just be much cheaper and frankly, much lower risk to run two separate studies. But yeah.
Back on the European market, can one trial meet all regulatory requirements in France and Germany? And will upcoming changes in legislation have an impact on trial design?
I would be not so much optimistic about that. I would say not before a couple of years at least. I mean, that's the same than talking about flexibility and real world evidence and all of that. There is dynamic moving to an harmonization in clinical evidence and clinical requirements. I don't know what you're feeling about that, Torsten, but from my perspective, I'm really feeling that there is a gap between what's accepted right now by the authorities and what's the goal actually. So there will be a goal for, I would say, like 2026, but in the next couple of years, I don't expect to have one clinical trial to be legitimate for different countries, even in EU.
Yeah, I don't see one big trial fulfilling everything happening, because I think it could be easier that you have one market, maybe Germany. You have a high quality data, bringing controlled data, showing the effectiveness and the superiority of your device, versus not using that versus a standard of care. And then maybe you can do in France a different kind of study, not fulfilling the same high criteria, have it a little bit easier, lower sample size, for instance, or a study focusing on showing the transferability. And maybe then you have two studies, but with different intensities. But whether this works, I mean, as Mary said at the beginning, we don't really know how this in France now evolves and whether the authorities will accept such approach. But I think that this could be something working. It could be, of course, the other way around. Later on, if you have high quality data from France, trying to apply for DiGA with a lower size study. But still for Germany, you would need Germany-based data. So you at least have to show this transferability. At the end, I think that the authorities, this approval process is like a risk mitigation process. So the more data you have, the more trials you have, the more convincing you can make your scientific case, the better it is. And I think having more than one studies, having high quality studies helps you a lot. So I would always invest in more and bigger and better trials.
So next question, what are the greatest trial challenges for DTX? And to what extent are these unique to EU versus present globally?
Maybe one thing in Germany is that you would usually need a physician prescribing the DiGA. You don't necessarily need that in a trial, but somehow a physician is involved. So you would never ever be successful in just thinking about the patient. So you always have to think about the physician. And one physician equals not the other physician. There's specialties. There are other expert groups besides the physician. So it's a very complex network. It's different in every diseases. It may be different in different areas in Germany, and rural versus urban areas. So it's very complex, and you have to think a lot of deciders involved. It's not only the patients using the device. So you have to really have that in mind and have a good strategy. And I think that your study should somehow a little bit reflect what you later on plan as a market access strategy. So I think it's not advisable to just focus on the patients for recruitment and then focus on the physicians to get your product really prescribed and used in the market. At least that's what I would think after my experience in the field of DiGA.
I can maybe jump in just.
Yeah, go.
Oh, it's fine. Well, I mean, just really quick. I mean, you know, there are some unique challenges posed by DTX products. So, like, you know, achieving sort of true blinding is very difficult because you can't just give a patient, you know, a placebo pill and like I mean, you can't really give them. They'll know if the app they're using, for instance, is not delivering anything. And you know, you also have you know, some challenges around kind of using it in a real world setting. You know, clinical study sites don't necessarily mimic where a patient might use, you know, a DTX app at home. But I think, you know, these are generally pretty minor, and you know, there are ways of dealing with these. For instance, you know, comparative we've talked about in Germany, sort of comparing it to a waitlist control. The FDA solution obviously a bit different, using a sham app, but you know, but that has its own problems. But yeah.
I'm just fully aligned with those trends, just about the market entry strategy, and actually that's aligned also with the previous answer, just about the cost of clinical trials. You can think about, I mean, the costs are huge, but since we are digital products, you really should align that with your strategy and think about that like as a cost of acquisition from a patient, and align all of that. So what you do in your clinical trials, it enables really to build the first start of your business post approval, and that's really key to really you're gonna win a lot of time by doing that and make sure those two really aligns. And you don't do a clinical trial just for doing a clinical trial. Those two should be totally aligned. So you gain experience and you gain the knowledge about how you're going to acquire your patient, how you're going to treat it, what's going to be the lifetime value, and so on. So you're going to have the first economics inside the clinical trials too. And that's for DTX, that's a huge that's a huge benefit, because you can't really do that with drugs. So definitely benefit for us to accelerate the market entry.
Thank you. What if you are a DiGA already? Do you still need data for getting the PECAN approval? So we've been through this a little bit, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to that data portability question where, you know, in theory, you should be able to submit German data. In practice, I don't believe anyone's done that yet, or I think, you know, all the you know, everyone is just planning to submit data from France, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
So what I understand about the PECAN process, and what I hear from people being interested in the field, that you need at least some kind of study in France, although you have the best data in Germany and getting permanent approval in Germany already. But I mean, there's a lot to learn, so. And I don't know that from first experience. There's a question in the chat about how the regulation looks like after you get the permanent DiGA approval in Germany. And so there is no specific regulation done by the BfArM because you are a DiGA. You just have to follow the medical device regulation, and therefore you have to have a post-market clinical follow-up, and you have to have a system for that. But there's nothing, to my knowledge, which is specifically for you to do because you are a DiGA now. And the BfArM also is the authorities supervising or having a look at the medical devices anyway, so it's the same authority, although it may be different offices within that authority, but there are no specific rules for that. I don't know how that will be in France. Maybe François, you know anything about that?
Not so much. I'll pass on that one.
We also have a question about the DTX clinical trial that are low standard and not up to the mark. This is a comment. What is your take on this? Do we need trials for DTX as good as traditional pharma trials for reimbursement?
Yeah, I saw this. Oh, you go for it.
Yeah. Okay, no, just to say I fully disagree actually with that comment. That's a myth. DTX trial are good standard. I mean, that's a totally myth. You can do double-blind, multi-centric, randomized controlled trial controlled by a placebo. It's hard work though. It's definitely hard work, but you can definitely do that and have really super high quality standard for those trials. And from my perspective, actually, this is necessary. But I know I could be a bit rigorous about that, but that's necessary because DTX, it's a new field and you need to be also like super clean about your data to bring just compliance and trust into the product. So I would say that at least us, I mean, since it's a very new field, we should do that. We should do those super rigorous trial to don't have those type of myth that DTX are low standard products and low standard clinical trials. Once we're going to be able to build trust, then we're going to be able to do real world clinical trials, and that's going to show that actually it has also effects. It has also bring some quality data and so on. But that's the first step, which is necessary, according to me.
I would like to agree because I don't see a big difference in classical pharma studies and DTX studies. I think one difference is that normally in DTX studies, you have an open label study because it's not very, mostly it's not even possible to blind your control because it's like multimodal therapies. It's very often behavioral therapy and people know and would notice in which study group they have been allocated. So I think this is a difference between the DTX as the product you look for efficacy for and a pharmaceutical intervention, because like a placebo-controlled pill is very easy, at least in comparison to build. So you have a little bit higher quality data because of this, and this is like a difference in design. So I think we will end up having different assessment tools for looking at DTX studies and looking at pharmaceutical intervention studies. And today we are very knowledgeable about the way how we should do pharmaceutical intervention studies, but we are very new in the field of doing DTX studies. So sorry, Mary, I saw that you wanted to say something too.
No, yeah, would completely agree with that point on the open label. I mean, also, we've definitely seen this when speaking with pharma. Bluntly, it just feels like there is a inherent bias there against digital products. How could they ever be as good as a drug? But also, there are lots of badly designed, poor evidence drug studies, and undoubtedly, there are also some, badly designed, kind of poorly carried out DTX studies. I think it's just very, very hard to make the general claim that, DTX studies generally are of low quality or unsupported by evidence. Yeah.
We also have another question for CNS and psychiatric disorders. Standard of care is often medication. Does this mean DiGA expects DTX to match or exceed drug response?
I mean, I'm not an expert in that field because we don't have a DiGA in that field, but I think one very central aspect is what Mary said at the beginning, at least in Germany for DiGA, you really have to look at what is the care reality, and you have to try to reflect that care reality within your control group. So if the care reality is really that all the patients receive medication, you somehow have to reflect that within the study. And if you define that the standard of care is, for instance, that patients receive a medical treatment with a pharmaceutical intervention, then you should have that and try to prove your add-on effect with a DiGA. So without being an expert in that field, that would be my take on this.
Okay, we also have like a legal question. I think it's interesting. Are there legal considerations for risks related to study design? Maybe for Mary.
Yeah, good question. I mean, a few ways to answer this. I mean, I think there are technically always, legal risks when you're conducting a clinical trial using human subjects, just because DiGA devices are low risk doesn't change that. So I think, every company who is running a clinical trial as the clinical trial sponsor, you would need to have clinical trial insurance. That's a requirement in Europe, the same as it is in the US. Obviously, the risk there is lower, but there is still theoretically a risk of, some kind of unintended device effect. I think in Europe, another risk you need to be aware of, particularly in Germany, and Torsten, you brought this up as well, is just, the sort of data privacy compliance. Important that, you're kind of insured against that risk, and, you make sure you adhere to all standards there, so you're not up to legal challenge. Guidelines in there in Germany are particularly, or requirements in Germany are particularly strong there. And then lastly, if you're working with a CRO, anti-CRO like us, obviously important that provider has, effectively clinical trial insurance as well to cover you from any risk. I mean, generally, whenever we run a study for someone, we, indemnify our client, the sponsor, against all kind of, gross negligence, not following regulations on our part, just to ensure that, as a sponsor, your risk is as limited as possible. But yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you, Mary. I have another question. I think it's directed to Torsten. Can you speak more about negotiated pricing that is reimbursed after the first year? So probably in Germany. Do you pay back the difference between the price you set in that first year after a new price is set? What is your DTX service offering? Has higher cost than the previous comparable services, and will the negotiated pricing still fall to a certain amount? And is there a ceiling?
Ooh, a lot of questions. I mean, this pricing topic is very complex, right? So you can set your own price for the first 12 months, meaning that from the first day of month 13, you have then the negotiated price. But you will not negotiate that price before you have permanent DiGA listing and the approval. And then you have like a time frame, which is, I think, something between like 6 to 12 months. So you have to start after 3 months negotiating with 3 appointments. So it's like the manufacturer with the umbrella organization of the statutory health insurance. And then at the end, you will have a price. And up to now, always this permanent price have been lower than the preliminary price. And it could end up that you have like 12 months or even 1.5 years between that day in which the negotiated price is effective and the time you know the negotiated price. And then you have to pay that back. And all the insurances, I think we have something like 100 insurances in Germany, they have to bill you for what they paid you too much. And you have to be able then to pay that back. And you see that this for a startup company is quite a challenge to navigate that risk and to know that. And you also see that this is very crucial for your long-term success to have a good price negotiated. And there are several base, or at least several criteria on which the price is set. So basically, it's what you can negotiate with the insurances. Although it's for clear that the insurance will start with a very low price, and you as a manufacturer have an interest of a very high price, and you will somewhere meet in the middle. But there is no standard. If you cannot rule out a final price with the insurance in 3 appointments, then you hand over the issue to an arbitration court. They will then decide a price. And this is like a finally decided price. Of course, you can hand in the lawsuit against that, but this is a very complex, long topic, and there is no standardized mechanism written in law, although it starts to be the usual case that they try to look for the reference price for that kind of care. For instance, if you as a DiGA substitute 12 sessions with a physiotherapist, they would look for the cost of this 12 sessions with a physiotherapist and look how much higher is your treatment effect, and then you get like an add-on between 15 or 30% of that price. So it's not only your efficacy, it's also how much costs you have for your reference therapy. And the question is, what if there is no reference therapy? So to my knowledge, there haven't been a case yet in which this have not been true. But I mean, there's a lot of ifs and possibilities and nothing for sure.
Well,
I hope this somehow answers the question. I mean, there have been a lot of questions, and it's not an easy answer to that.
Well, I mean, thank you, all of you, for this great webinar. Any last word to conclude, like pretty quickly, because we're at the top of the hour?
Yeah, I think that you should always think about the patient, because the patient is not the one sitting at the table. It's authorities, insurances, manufacturers, and all this theory and study thing. But at the end, we do that for the patients. So I try to very often think about the patient and that we do that for the patients.
François?
In the better, that's a great word to finish this webinar. So I'll let you on that.
And Mary, do you want to say one last word?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely would agree with that, Torsten. And also, like, we've been diving into the complexities here, but I think, ultimately DiGA and now PECAN look like they're fantastic options for companies in this space, and, definitely worth exploring, even if you're not, local to these geographies. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. And we hope you enjoyed this webinar. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.